A photograph sits in the permanent collection of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It was taken sometime between 1862 and 1875. In it, a woman is seated in a chair, her expression composed, almost vacant. Behind her, hovering in the dim air, are a pair of disembodied arms. They appear to be showering her with flowers. The arms belong to no one in the room. They belong, according to the man who took this photograph, to someone who had already been dead for years. The photographer was not a ghost hunter. He was not a priest. He was an engraver by trade and an amateur chemist by habit, and he turned the grief of a nation into one of the most profitable businesses of the 19th century. But he is only one thread in a story that runs far deeper, because behind him stood a whole invisible architecture, an industry of mediums, publishers, scientists, and showmen who had discovered something extraordinary. They had discovered that the most reliable market in the world is not luxury, not vice, not entertainment. It is sorrow. And what no one has ever fully explained is what happened when the scientists arrived to expose it all and came out believers instead. Welcome. You are watching EPOCH RESET, the channel that goes looking for the histories that did not survive the official record cleanly. I am Elliot Carter, and before we go any further, I want to ask you to do something. Subscribe right now, not because a button told you to, but because what we are about to walk through together is the kind of story that deserves a witness. 6 chapters. One of the most carefully constructed mass deceptions in modern history. And at least one moment in this video where I think you will genuinely stop and ask yourself, but what if they were not lying? We are going to trace the full arc of Victorian Spiritualism, from the night 2 sisters in upstate New York claimed to hear a dead man knocking, all the way to the moment a decorated chemist pressed his hands to a medium's table and decided the rationalists had been wrong the entire time. We are going to look at the mechanics of the trick, the technologies that made it possible, the grief that made it irresistible, and the one court case that almost unraveled everything. And near the end, I am going to show you a pattern in the witness testimony that no one in the official literature quite wants to sit with directly. Stay with me. This one earns it. The perfect storm. Grief as a market. To understand how Victorian spiritualism became what it became, you first have to understand what death looked like in the 1800s. It was everywhere, all the time, unavoidable in a way that is very difficult to reconstruct from a world with antibiotics and emergency medicine. One historical account that runs through nearly every serious study of this period describes the same brutal statistic. In Victorian England, 1 in every 5 children died before the age of 5. That figure appears in Janet Oppenheim's academic study, The Other World, published by Cambridge University Press in 1985. And it surfaces repeatedly in period primary sources. Cholera swept through English cities in 1832, 1848, 1854, and 1866. The 1866 outbreak alone killed over 14,000 people in England and Wales, according to records from the General Register Office. Life expectancy in industrial cities like Manchester hovered around 28 years for working-class residents, according to a report issued by the Manchester Statistical Society in the 1840s. Grief was not a private interruption in the Victorian age. It was the texture of ordinary life. And into that grief in the spring of 1848 walked 2 sisters from a small town called Hydesville in upstate New York, and they announced they had found the door. Margaret and Kate Fox were teenagers. Their family had recently moved into a house with an uncomfortable reputation. The story the sisters told, and told very publicly, was that they had established a coded communication with the spirit of a man murdered there years before. Knocks on the floor and walls. 1 for yes, 2 for no. Simple, terrifying, and perfectly designed for a public that had never been asked to think critically about what a knock in the night might mean. The New York Tribune published the story. Papers across the Atlantic followed. According to accounts preserved in the spiritualist press and cited in multiple subsequent scholarly histories, the Fox sisters moved from a rural farmhouse to public stages within months. They had managers. They had ticketed audiences. The movement had begun. The movement did not spread purely because people were credulous. It spread because it arrived at the perfect intersection of technology, social anxiety, and institutional failure. The Industrial Revolution had pulled hundreds of thousands of people out of villages and away from the communal structures that had historically processed death. The parish church, the extended family, the burial ground you walked past every day. In the new industrial cities, people died among strangers and were expected to grieve quietly and return to work. The established church offered heaven as doctrine. Spiritualism offered something radically different. It offered a conversation. And that distinction between an abstract promise and a live exchange is the entire engine of what was about to follow. But here is what I want you to sit with. The people running séances were not primarily targeting the uneducated poor. The first British sitters, according to the spiritualist press of the 1850s, were physicians, professors, lawyers, and writers. So why did the most educated class in the country line up to pay for something that, from the outside, looked exactly like theater? The answer has everything to do with what science was doing at that exact moment. By the 1850s, Darwin's ideas were reshaping the intellectual landscape. The literal reading of Scripture was under pressure from geology, from biology, from biblical criticism. For a generation of educated Victorians raised on Christian certainty about the soul's survival, this was genuinely disorienting. Spiritualism arrived as what seemed like a third option, neither old blind faith nor cold new materialism. It claimed to be empirical. It claimed to produce evidence. It said, "You do not have to choose between God and science, because here is a spirit rapping on a table, and you can measure the raps yourself." That framing was central to the movement's appeal among the educated classes. And it is the reason that when, in 1852, an American medium named Maria B. Hayden arrived in London conducting séances at a guinea per head, roughly 5 guineas for a group of 10, she was not dismissed. She was analyzed, written about, attended by curious intellectuals. According to historian Alex Owen in The Darkened Room, published by the University of Chicago Press, the movement spread through the drawing rooms of the middle class before it spread anywhere else. The spiritualist press covered her extensively, and within months there were local British mediums operating their own circles. The drawing rooms had money, a great deal of it. By the 1860s, the infrastructure of a genuine industry was in place. There were public mediums who worked halls and theaters, charging admission and advertising in newspapers. There were private mediums operating in homes. Specialist newspapers had been established. The British Spiritualist Telegraph ran from 1857 to 1859, the Spiritual Magazine from 1859 to 1877, and Medium and Daybreak from 1870 to 1895. By the 1870s, there were formal organizations, including the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, founded in 1872, and the British National Association of Spiritualists, founded in 1873. This was not a fringe curiosity. This was an institution with a press, a membership, and a revenue stream. And the revenue stream had a very specific source. It was war. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, with approximately 620,000 dead, the United States was saturated with grief in a way that had no modern equivalent. A documented exhibition account compiled for the O. Henry Museum estimates that by the end of the conflict, around 11 million people in the United States identified as adherents of spiritualism, with roughly 35,000 practicing mediums. Those figures carry the usual uncertainty of self-reported period surveys, but even a fraction of that scale represents an extraordinary commercial phenomenon. The grief had become a market, and someone was about to figure out how to photograph it. What do you think drove educated Victorians into the séance room? Was it grief, intellectual curiosity, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, and this question has a genuinely complicated answer that I want to hear your take on. The camera that could see the dead. William H. Mumler was born in 1832. Before he became the most controversial photographer in the United States, he was a jeweler's engraver in Boston, a tinkerer with a persistent appetite for side ventures, including, according to the biography assembled by author Peter Manso in The Apparitionists, a homemade elixir he sold for curing digestive complaints. In 1861, Mumler was using a friend's studio to teach himself the wet plate collodion process, the standard photographic method of the era. He took a self-portrait. When the plate developed, there was another figure visible at his side, a girl, luminous and faint, hovering over his shoulder. Mumler claimed with some plausibility that he had used a plate not fully cleared of a previous image. He showed the photograph to friends as a curiosity. Then it found its way to the Banner of Light, a Boston spiritualist newspaper, and as Manso documents, the story traveled fast. Mumler revised his origin story. The figure was not a darkroom artifact, he now said. It was his deceased cousin, dead for 12 years. His arm had gone numb when the photograph was taken. He could only manage a handful of spirit photographs per day because communing with spirits was exhausting. He charged $10 a sitting. He moved to New York City. His clients were largely bereaved. His most famous photograph shows a woman in a dark dress, composed and slightly haunted in expression. Standing behind her, hands resting on her shoulders, is the translucent figure of a tall man with a familiar beard. The woman is Mary Todd Lincoln. The figure, according to Mumler's claim, is her assassinated husband. The photograph is now held at the College of Psychic Studies in London, and its provenance has been the subject of persistent scholarly debate. Paranormal researcher Melvin Willen, cited in his book Ghosts Caught on Film, suggests Mumler did not know his sitter's identity when the image was taken. Notes attributed to William Stainton Moses suggest the photograph was taken in the early 1870s and that Mrs. Lincoln used a false name. The record on this detail is genuinely unclear and worth acknowledging honestly. What is not unclear is the technique. A scholarly analysis by Michael Leja, published by the University of California Press, describes how Mumler used double exposures, either working with plates not fully cleared of previous images or pre-exposing a plate with a ghostly figure, often a model in white positioned behind the sitter, and then photographing the client on the same surface. The ghost would appear faint and transparent, exactly what a spirit was supposed to look like. Photography was new. The public understood that a camera captured reality, but had no idea how it worked. When experienced photographers were invited to observe Mumler's process, some still could not identify the deception. James Wallace Black, a celebrated aerial photographer, personally attended a session, watched every step of the development, and could not explain the resulting spirit figure in the image. That detail is important because it tells us something the simple fraud story misses. Mumler was not just exploiting belief. He was exploiting the same awe that made photography feel magical to everyone who encountered it. The camera saw the dead because the camera could see things the eye could not. That was not a lie he invented. That was something his audience brought to the room themselves. By 1869, the cracks were showing. A doctor who sat for a portrait recognized the ghost in his photograph as a living person. Other clients came forward with similar complaints. The New York police sent a marshal named Joseph H. Tooker to Mumler's studio undercover, and when the spirit photograph showed a figure Tooker did not recognize, charges of fraud and larceny were filed. A week-long trial began in April of 1869. Harper's Weekly covered it in the May 8th edition of that year. The prosecution called photography experts who outlined at least 9 techniques by which the images could be faked. P.T. Barnum, The showman, who had spent decades studying how audiences allow themselves to be deceived, commissioned a photographer named Abraham Bogardus to produce a spirit photograph of Barnum alongside the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. Bogardus did it in an afternoon. Barnum brought the photograph to court. The judge believed trickery had occurred. The prosecution, however, could not prove precisely which method Mumler had used, and he was acquitted. His reputation was damaged enough that he eventually left spirit photography. But the industry he had validated did not stop. Other spirit photographers followed. William Hope in England, Edouard Isidore Bouguer in France, Frederick Hudson in London. The technique had been demonstrated. The market had been proven. What Mumler had done, more than anything else, was establish a template. Grief was the raw material. New technology was the mechanism. Scientific uncertainty was the cover. And somewhere in that combination lay something much harder to dismiss than simple fraud. Because the next group of people who walked into the séance room were not grieving relatives. They were scientists. And their story is where this gets genuinely strange. When science walked into the dark room, William Crookes was not a fringe figure. The temptation is to file him away as an eccentric who let sentiment override judgment. But Crookes, born in 1832, was one of the most decorated scientists in Victorian Britain. He discovered the element thallium in 1861. He invented the Crookes radiometer in 1876, and his work on cathode rays contributed foundational groundwork toward the eventual discovery of the electron. He received the Royal Medal from the Royal Society in 1875, and from 1913 to 1915 he served as the Society's president. He was, by any reasonable measure, a serious scientist with serious credentials. And in 1871 he walked into a séance with Daniel Douglas Home, the most celebrated physical medium of the Victorian era, and came out a believer. Home conducted his séances in relatively good light and had been tested by skeptics throughout his career without being caught in straightforward fraud. In the session Crookes attended, Home reportedly caused an accordion to play while the instrument was sealed inside a cage and produced a measurable deflection on a plank monitored by a spring balance. Crookes published his account in his Quarterly Journal of Science in July of 1871, describing a force he called a psychic force, a genuine undiscovered phenomenon he believed was emanating from the medium's body. The Royal Society rejected the paper. His colleagues were broadly unimpressed. One critic argued that the phenomena Crookes reported could not have occurred because they were impossible. Crookes, according to multiple period accounts, replied, "I never said it was possible. I only said it was true." 3 years later, in 1874, Crookes published reports of an extended investigation of a young medium named Florence Cook, who claimed to materialize a full physical spirit during her séances. The spirit was called Katie King. She appeared from behind a cabinet in the darkened room, solid enough to be touched and photographed. Crookes photographed them together. He stated publicly that Cook and King were distinct individuals, that King was taller and prettier than Cook, and that, unlike Cook, King's ears were not pierced. What happened inside that cabinet during Florence Cook's séances is one of the genuinely unresolved questions of Victorian psychical research. Because in 1922, long after Cook's death, a man walked into the offices of the Society for Psychical Research and made a statement that, if accurate, reframes everything about Crookes. Francis G. H. Anderson told the SPR's research officer that he had had an affair with Florence Cook and that she had confided in him that her mediumship was fraudulent. More than that, she had allegedly told him that she and Crookes had been romantically involved and that the famous séances had been staged partly to facilitate that relationship. Anderson repeated and expanded this account in 1949 to SPR researcher Mrs. K. M. Goldney. The Society's own summary, preserved in the archives at Cambridge University Library, acknowledges these testimonies but notes the obvious problem. They are hearsay, reported decades after the events by a single witness. Cook herself had been caught in fraud during a séance in 1880 and again in 1889, both occasions documented in the SPR archives and in contemporary newspaper accounts. Crookes was also caught at least once in something the evidence strongly suggests was not rational assessment. In 1916, recently widowed and 83 years old, he submitted to a session with a spirit photographer at the Crew Circle, a group operating in the English Midlands. The resulting plate appeared to show his late wife's face in luminous space. His colleague Sir Oliver Lodge examined it and pointed out clear signs of double exposure. The image had been copied from a known anniversary photograph. Crookes died in 1919, still insisting the image was genuine. His biographer, William Hodson Brock, noted something worth adding. Crookes was severely short-sighted and did not wear spectacles until the 1890s. He may, in a literal rather than metaphorical sense, have been unable to see what was actually happening in the cabinet during the séances he attended 2 decades earlier. What is not ambiguous is what Crookes's endorsement did for the industry. When a scientist of his standing published positive accounts of mediumistic phenomena in his own peer-reviewed journal, it became significantly harder for the skeptical establishment to simply wave the movement away. The ghost industry had acquired scientific cover, and that cover was about to be given a formal institutional address. In 1882, a group of Cambridge philosophers and scientists formally established the Society for Psychical Research. Its founding president was Henry Sidgwick, a fellow of Trinity College and professor of moral philosophy. Early members included Alfred Tennyson, William Gladstone, and John Ruskin. Later additions included William James, Nobel laureate Charles Richet, and the physicists J.J. Thomson and Lord Rayleigh. The Society's stated purpose, recorded in its proceedings from 1882 onward, was to investigate human capacities that appeared inexplicable by contemporary scientific models, using the same rigorous methods that had enabled science to solve other difficult problems. It was also within the SPR that the word telepathy was coined by founding member Frederick Myers in the 1880s. The word entered the language and never left. It is worth pausing on that membership list. These were not wishful thinkers. These were men who had contributed to the theory of electromagnetic radiation, who had won the highest scientific prizes in the world, and they were sitting in dark rooms waiting for tables to float. What does that tell us? It tells us something more uncomfortable than simple gullibility. The universe they worked in was still full of forces that could not be seen and could barely be measured. X-rays had not yet been discovered. Radioactivity had not been described. The electron had not been isolated. In that context, the idea that some undiscovered force might be associated with human consciousness was not obviously more absurd than invisible waves carrying light across space. The SPR was not populated by fools. It was populated by people who had learned to take the unknown seriously and who had not yet drawn the precise boundary between the unknown that science would eventually explain and the unknown it would not. If the most rigorous scientific organization in Victorian Britain spent decades investigating séances and came away with results ranging from certain fraud to genuine uncertainty, what does that tell us about the limits of the scientific method when the subject of study is determined to subvert the experiment? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I am genuinely curious what you think, because I do not think there is a clean answer here. The mechanics of the miracle. Let us step back from the question of belief and look at the machinery, because one of the things the official history of Victorian Spiritualism tends to underplay is how sophisticated the deception infrastructure actually was. This was not dim-witted audiences being fooled by obvious tricks. The methods used by working mediums in the 1870s and 80s drew on chemistry, optics, engineering, and performance craft in ways that were genuinely ahead of popular understanding. A typical séance, as described in multiple period accounts, including Catherine Berry's 1876 memoir, Experiences in Spiritualism, would begin with participants seated in a circle, hands joined, in a room either entirely dark or lit by a single dim lamp. The darkness was justified as a necessary spiritual condition. From a purely practical standpoint, it eliminated the primary tool of critical observation. The table rapping that made the Fox sisters famous could be replicated by any practitioner with flexible joints. A researcher named S.J. Davy, working with the Society for Psychical Research in the late 1880s, staged a series of fake séances under an assumed name for educated audiences, including other SPR members. He reproduced every effect the movement's celebrated mediums had produced and then revealed his methods afterward. The published account in the SPR Journal exposed how easily even skeptically inclined witnesses could be persuaded that they had observed something inexplicable. The spiritualist community's response was fury. Some SPR members resigned in protest, arguing that Davy's results had been so convincing the séances must have been genuine after all. Think about that for a moment. Phosphorescent paint, whose applications were being refined throughout the Victorian era, allowed a medium in a dark room to produce the appearance of glowing hands, floating faces, or luminous writing using compounds applied to cloth or paper. Magnets were used by some mediums to animate small objects on séance tables, creating the appearance of spontaneous movement. The levitation of tables, one of the most commonly reported phenomena in séance accounts, could be achieved by a medium wearing a specially designed device under their clothing that hooked onto the table's underside, combined with the anchoring effect of joined hands that prevented other sitters from repositioning for a clear view from below. The ectoplasm phenomenon deserves particular attention. Ectoplasm, allegedly exuded by mediums in trance states and claimed to be the material through which spirits took physical form, was one of the more spectacular productions of late Victorian séances. When examined under controlled conditions, which occasionally happened when skeptical investigators seized a sample, it consistently turned out to be gauze, cheesecloth, egg white, or similar materials. One analysis in the SPR archives noted the presence of partly chewed paper and animal tissue. The medium had been concealing the material in body cavities and producing it on demand. This is not comfortable to describe, and I am not going to dress it up. But it illustrates something important about both the lengths practitioners were prepared to go and the depths of need in their clients that made the performance worth the extraordinary effort. When you understand the full sophistication of the apparatus, the phosphor paint, the hidden devices, the confederates in the audience, the pre-researched personal details fed to the medium before the session, you have to ask yourself what kind of person constructs all of that. Not a simple con artist, something more like an architect. And an architect builds for a specific purpose. The pre-research element is what most accounts understate. A successful medium did not walk into a session without preparation. Before a wealthy client arrived, assistants would mine the obituary columns of newspapers, consult local registries of births, marriages, and deaths, and gather intelligence from domestic servants in prosperous households. The client's clothing and personal effects, examined while they waited, yielded names, dates, and relationships. Rings, lockets, photographs, and monogrammed items all carried information. By the time the medium sat down in the darkened room, they already knew a great deal about the person across the table. What followed was not magic. It was research and performance combined, and the combination produced experiences that even intelligent and skeptical witnesses struggled to explain on the spot. The fully sophisticated machinery of the séance was also, at its worst, an instrument for extracting money from people in no condition to resist it. A widow, unnamed in most accounts to protect the family, attended a series of séances in London in the 1870s. She had lost her husband and 2 of her 3 children to disease within 18 months, according to a case summary preserved in the Society for Psychical Research archives. The medium conveyed names, dates, and details the widow recognized. She began attending regularly, paying for private sessions. According to correspondence later donated to the SPR, she spent the majority of her late husband's estate over roughly 2 years on medium fees and donations to spiritualist publications. By the time she sought advice from a solicitor, she had almost nothing left. The medium, when confronted indirectly, denied wrongdoing and pointed to the sincerity of the widow's own testimony about the comfort the sessions had provided. That argument, comfort as justification, was the industry's most reliable defense. It was not entirely dishonest. The comfort was real, but it does not resolve the ethical problem of extracting money from the bereaved under false pretenses. The night it broke a family. The Fox sisters' confession. The Fox sisters, whose rapping in that Hydesville farmhouse in 1848 had set the whole mechanism in motion, did not have good endings. Margaret Kate and their older sister Leah performed public séances across the United States through the 1850s and into the 1860s. Leah, the eldest, managed the commercial apparatus with considerable acumen and eventually married a prosperous stockbroker named Daniel Underhill, becoming a respected figure in New York's spiritualist community. Margaret and Kate had considerably harder trajectories. Both struggled with alcohol, a detail mentioned across multiple period accounts. Kate's children were temporarily removed by New York child welfare authorities in the 1880s due to concerns about her capacity to care for them, a fact recorded in contemporary newspaper coverage. Then, in October of 1888, Margaret Fox Kane walked onto a stage at the New York Academy of Music and told the audience that the rapping had been a trick from the beginning. She demonstrated how she produced the sounds by cracking the joints of her toes. A written confession was published simultaneously in the New York World. The newspaper account, one of the most widely reprinted documents in the history of the movement, described the entire 40 years of American spiritualism as originating in a childish prank that spiraled so far beyond its origins that the sisters themselves had been unable to stop it. Margaret described the deception in terms that mixed guilt with resentment. The text, as preserved in newspaper archives, suggests someone who had been carrying a secret that felt less like power and more like a trap. She said the sounds began as a way of frightening their mother. They had not anticipated what would follow. No one had. Kate did not join Margaret in the confession. The relationship between them, already strained by years of competition, was apparently broken by the public recantation. Leah, now wealthy and socially established, called the confession a betrayal. The spiritualist community closed ranks. The Banner of Light published a rebuttal arguing the sisters were lying, possibly coerced by anti-spiritualist interests, or acting under the influence of alcohol. Margaret recanted her recantation the following year. She died in poverty in 1893. Kate died in poverty in the same year. The movement they had started was, by that point, an institution that no longer needed them. Here is the detail I want you to hold on to. After both confessions and recantations, after both sisters had died in poverty, the movement did not diminish. If anything, the controversy had given it new energy. What does it mean that the founders of American spiritualism publicly confessed to fraud and the movement continued essentially unchanged? It means the movement had long since ceased to be about the Fox sisters. It was about something the audiences needed, something a confession could not take away. The spiritualist press understood this perfectly. The Banner of Light's response was not really an argument about the truth. It was an argument about what the community could afford to believe. That pattern, a community absorbing disconfirmation by reinterpreting the source rather than the practices themselves, appears in the Fox sisters' story, in the Crookes and Cook controversy, and in the Mumler trial. The investigation arrives. The fraud is demonstrated or strongly suggested. The community responds not by abandoning the belief, but by questioning the investigators. because the Society for Psychical Research, for all its eventual skeptical findings, produced at least one result that no one has cleanly explained in the 140 years since it was published. In the 1880s and 90s, the Society conducted what it called the Census of Hallucinations, an extensive survey asking whether respondents had ever experienced a vivid hallucination of someone they knew to be living. More than 17,000 responses were collected and analyzed. The results, published in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research in 1894, indicated that a statistically anomalous number of these hallucinations occurred at or near the moment the person hallucinated was dying. The Society's analysts were cautious. They acknowledged the problems of self-report, of memory distortion, of confirmation bias. They did not claim the finding proved survival after death. But they noted that the coincidence rate exceeded what random chance alone would predict, and they could not fully account for it. That result has never been definitively explained. Whether it represents something real about human consciousness or simply an artifact of how memory works under emotional stress remains genuinely open. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, a character whose entire existence is a monument to rational deduction, became one of spiritualism's most passionate public advocates after the First World War, having lost his son Kingsley, his brother Innes, and several close friends. He published The History of Spiritualism in 1924. He argued publicly for the validity of the Cottingley Ferry photographs, which had been produced by two young girls using paper cutouts. He was almost certainly wrong about the photographs. Whether he was wrong about everything is harder to answer cleanly than the popular memory of this story suggests. In 1930, Conan Doyle resigned from the SPR, taking 84 members with him in a mass resignation noted in the Society's archives, because he believed the organization had become a mechanism for debunking rather than honest investigation. The Society believed it was doing exactly what it was always supposed to do: follow the evidence. That split maps the essential fault line of the entire Victorian ghost industry, and it has never fully healed. The Long Shadow: What the Industry Left Behind. In 1916, William Crookes was 83 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of a photograph. The image appeared to show his late wife's face floating in luminous space, taken at a session with the Crew Circle in the English Midlands. Sir Oliver Lodge examined the plate and pointed out clear signs of double exposure. The image had been copied from a known anniversary photograph. Crookes died in April of 1919, still insisting the image was genuine. A man who had discovered an element, contributed to the work that led toward the identification of the electron, and served as president of the Royal Society, spent the last years of his life defending a spirit photograph. I want to use that detail not as a punchline, because it is not one, but as a lens through which to examine what the Victorian ghost industry actually accomplished in the long run. The first thing it produced was a vocabulary. The word telepathy, coined by Frederick Myers in the 1880s, is now in every dictionary in the English language. The concept of the subconscious, developed in part through the SPR's investigations into trance states and automatic writing, fed into the early work of psychologists including William James and, at greater remove, Sigmund Freud, both of whom held associations with the SPR at various points. The Census of Hallucinations was one of the first large-scale surveys of subjective psychological experience in the modern sense, and the methodology it developed influenced psychological research methods in ways that outlasted the specific questions it was trying to answer. The ghost industry, for all its fraud, produced intellectual infrastructure that the 20th century used. The second thing it produced was an infrastructure of grief support that, however fraudulent in its central claims, performed a real function for a society that had no secular equivalent. The established church was, for many educated people, no longer a fully convincing source of comfort about death. The scientific establishment offered materialism, the message that consciousness ended at death and that the dead were simply gone. Spiritualism offered something in between, a community of people who shared your loss, a set of rituals organized around the possibility of continued connection, a gathering where the names of the dead were spoken aloud and treated as still relevant. That function did not require the phenomena to be genuine. When the movement eventually faded in its Victorian form, the function did not disappear. It migrated into new containers. The third thing it produced is the element that deserves the most careful attention, a template for the relationship between grief, technology, and commercial exploitation that has repeated itself in every subsequent generation. The pattern Mumler established in 1861, new technology plus uncertainty about what the technology can do, plus a market saturated with unprocessed loss, did not end with spirit photography. It appears in the early radio era when broadcasts from the deceased were claimed to be possible. It appears in electronic voice phenomena research in the 1960s when researchers claimed to find voices of the dead in recorded static. It appears today in the emerging market for artificial intelligence systems constructed from the digital records of deceased individuals, sold to the bereaved as a way of continuing the conversation. The technology changes. The mechanism is identical. A new device that the public does not fully understand. A claim that it can reach across the threshold between the living and the dead. A market of grieving people prepared to pay for that claim. What the Victorian case gives us, at a distance of 150 years, is something the current iterations of this phenomenon do not yet have. An ending we can examine. We can see what the industry built, what it consumed, and what it left behind when the energy passed. The mediums aged, retired, or were exposed. The organizations fragmented over the question of how much evidence was enough. The scientists who endorsed the phenomena spent later years managing the reputational consequences. The clients who had spent their savings had, in most cases, no recourse and no acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. And yet the grief itself was never addressed. The question the industry promised to answer, whether the dead continue to exist, whether consciousness survives the body, whether the severed connection can somehow be maintained, remained open when the curtain came down. It remains open now. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, is still in operation. Its journal is still published. Its archives, held at Cambridge University Library, still contain thousands of witness accounts, experimental reports, and correspondence between scientists who could not agree on what they had seen in those dark rooms. The pattern in the witness testimony I mentioned earlier has one more feature I have not yet described. In a significant number of the most detailed first-person accounts, the sitter reports that they knew on some level that what they were experiencing might not be genuine. They attended anyway. They paid anyway. They came back anyway. When pressed on this in the letters and memoirs that survived, they gave an answer that appears so often it begins to feel like the honest center of the whole enterprise. They said that even if the medium was performing, the performance had shown them something true, that their grief was real, that the person they had lost had been real, and that the world in which the loss occurred was not indifferent to either of those facts. Whether that justifies the industry is a question I am not going to answer for you. But the question of whether a consolation has to be literally true in order to be genuinely useful is one the Victorians were living inside without quite knowing how to articulate it, and the ghost industry was, among other things, a prolonged and very expensive attempt to work out that question in public. Queen Victoria herself, who according to multiple period accounts participated in séances with Prince Albert before his death in 1861 and reportedly continued seeking contact through mediums afterward, never publicly acknowledged or denied her involvement. The royal household maintained silence on the subject throughout her reign. The private correspondence, some of which remains in the royal archives at Windsor and has not been fully examined by independent scholars, may tell a different story. We cannot confirm what is in those letters, if anything. But the suggestion that the most powerful woman in the Victorian world was, in her private grief, seeking the same impossible thing as the widow who spent her last savings on a London medium, is one that the official history has never quite wanted to sit with directly. That, I think, is the most revealing thing about the Victorian ghost industry of all. Not who it deceived, but who it did not distinguish between. It found the same need in the queen and the seamstress, in the scientist and the factory worker, in the skeptic who attended once to prove it was nonsense, and the believer who came every week for 30 years. It found the one thing that class and education and rational conviction cannot protect against: the loss of someone you love and the silence that follows. That industry built itself on that silence. It did very well for a very long time, and when it finally faded, the silence was still there, exactly as it had been at the beginning. That is where I want to leave this. Not with a clean verdict, because the record does not support one, but with the question the evidence actually points toward: what do we owe to grief? As a society, as individuals, as the people who build the technologies and the institutions that surround the bereaved in the hardest moments of their lives. What is the honest answer to the need that drove millions of people into the arms of 35,000 mediums by the close of the American Civil War? The Victorians did not answer it honestly. The industry that rose in the absence of an honest answer was, in most of its forms, exploitative. But the question itself was legitimate. It may be the most legitimate question human beings ask. And if you look at what is being built right now with artificial intelligence and digital memorialization, you will notice that we are once again standing in the early days of a new technology, with a market saturated with unprocessed grief, and a set of practitioners who have understood that the gap between what the technology can do and what the grieving wish it could do is a gap you can charge entry to. Whether this time is different is, at this point, an open case file. What do you think? Does the sophistication of the deception change the ethical calculation? Or does the same logic apply regardless of the tool? Tell me in the comments. These conversations are why this channel exists, and I mean that without exaggeration. And if you have followed this investigation from the beginning and found it worth your time, subscribe to EPOCH RESET right now. Every episode is built with the same care as this one: real evidence, real uncertainty, and no easy conclusions. We will see you in the next one. I am Elliot Carter. This has been EPOCH RESET.